Scoring the Leetcode question 73 set matrix zeros, it's median question. So given the m multiplex n integer matrix, and if an element is 0, you need to set its entire row and column to 0. You must do this in place, and you can see there's 1 0 here in this example. You need to set the entire row and the entire column to 0. So this, and this, everything is 0. And second example, there's 1 0 here, another example 0 here, and then you need to set entire column, entire row to 0, and the entire row and the entire column to 0 as well. So that's why this is the answer. And there's some constraint here, and it already said if you use extra space, it's not so good idea. In a simple improvement using n plus n space, but not the best solution. So it basically wants you to use a constant space solution. And of course, you can brute force it and use some extra space to keep track of what you need to change, but that also not the best solution. It already told you. And here is the company asked this question last 6 months, and Microsoft asked this 6 times. So a better approach to solve this issue is you could just simply use the first row like 0 1 2 0 and the 0 3 1 to as a marker, as a head element to keep track of the row. For example, the 3, I use 3 to track if I should change for the rest of the row, and a 1 if I need to change for this row, and the 0 I can track changes for this row, and 1 I could keep track changes for this 143 column, and I use 2 for 251 column. So that will allow you to use constant space. And in this approach, basically you just continue to process every single 0 in this list, and after that the second you see a 0, you mark the head element to 0. And then once you mark that head element to 0 after you process everything, then you're going to go ahead to make changes to the rest of the element like this and this, except the first row and the first column. And in the end, after you make changes to these, and then you, according to the zeros here, and then you make changes to the for the first row and the first column to see if there's any changes needs to be made here. The only thing that you need to pay attention is that in this approach, there's a downside is that since you use this for this column, this column, this column, this column, right? There's a missing number because there's a missing element is because you use the first row and first column, and then the first element, it's all in the first element. So if you use for this same row, then you're actually missing one to keep track of this, the same with this column. So all you need to do is just use one extra constant space in the memory to store the value for this column. Let's say you can use the extra space for either column or row. It's totally up to you, whichever way you think is more convenient. And then you can process all of them together. And basically, that's how the thought process is. At beginning, you set this value to false, and if it's set to true, then if there's any 0 needs to be changed, you can set it to true. And in the end, if it's true, then you can make the changes. That's basically how you can solve this issue. And I'm going to show you how to do this in code. So I'm going to use our first call. I'm going to call it for first call, and I'm going to set it to first, basically one extra constant space here. Just imagine to store this value to keep track changes of the same row and the same column. And then I'm going to define the graph here, rows and calls equals to length of matrix, and then length of matrix 0, right? And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna keep track of changes of all the 0 first, and just gonna go through the entire matrix for R in range of rows, right? And then if the matrix if the matrix R0 equals to 0, basically if the that's the row and then that's the column, if the column 0, if there's any 0 in this here, if there's any 0 here, I'm gonna set the first call to true. That means later on I will need to change the entire row to true. So that we just remember first call equals to true right now. And then for C in range of calls, that's I'm gonna go through the columns. Oh, actually, since because we already did the first column, right? Because the first call is used to keep this track of this. Since we already go through the element that keep track of the first column, so I want to start a range from the first column and to the last column here. That's why. And then this is basically every single grade. If matrix RC equals to 0, right? If I find any 0, what I'm gonna do, I'm only gonna change if I find any 0, for example here, right, I'm gonna change the correspondent column and row number to 0, basically their head to 0, so that I know who is who and what changes that I need to make in the future. So there are two things that we need to change. Is one is the column C, and the other thing is if I do row and then the column 0 that I need to change, right? Whichever one you specify first, that's totally fine. The sequence doesn't really matter in this case, but you need to change to, if there's a, if I'm trying to say if there's a 0 here, you need to change this value and this value, basically their head value, so you will know that you will have to make some changes later on. So then what we're gonna do is that we're gonna go through the matrix, but not the first row and the first column, because those are the ones that we remember we need to make changes, right? So right now we're gonna make changes for the rest of the elements. If the row and column that we recorded, they are already set to 0, we need to change the correspondent element to 0 in this case. So for R in range, because it's not the first row, right? So I'm gonna say starting from the first row and then to the last row for C in range first and calls, right? So I'm gonna process the rest of the element. So if not matrix, so like if they are 0, if the head is 0, so if R0 or not matrix 0 C, basically the ones that we set it to 0 just now, if they're 0, right, I'm going to set matrix RC to 0. So I'm already processed all that according to the head element to 0 in this case. So that I have already changed this. Yep. And then so basically I already changed this guy to 0 and this guy to 0, right? And then what do we need to do is that if matrix 0, 0, this number that we use to keep track of the 0 row, basically 0 row and any columns, so any of this, and if this guy is 0, then we'll set the 0 row and all the columns to 0. So if matrix 0 equals to 0, in this case, equal to 0, right? And then for C in range of calls, I'm gonna check every single column and basically set the matrix 0 C to 0 in this case. So if this is 0, I'm gonna change this to 0 and this to 0, right? And there's another value is this way, right? The last step is that I'm gonna making changes for this last column. So if first the call, the one that we use to keep track of the column, this value here, and if it's true, right? And I'm gonna make changes is for R in range of calls. So basically for different rows, what I'm going to do is I'm gonna set matrix row and column 0 to 0 to 0. Basically, I'm gonna, now with this, I'm changing this one to 0 and I'm changing this one to 0. And yep, and that's basically the result that we're looking for. By doing this, that you're not using any extra space, because the first call is one element that you use in memory that's still considered a constant space, and you modified everything in place correctly. And let's see. Yep. Which index are out of range? Matrix line 35, matrix R. If first call for R in range calls, oh, this is first for R in range of rows, I'm sorry, for R in range of rows and the matrix R0. Yep, it's accepted. That is correct. I hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll please like my video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you with more Leetcode questions. Bye bye.